Hi, I am Dr. Cyril Pernet. I am here on behalf of INCF to talk about data management plans and GDPR. Before we start, let me tell you a little bit about my background. I am not an admin person or a ground person that requires you to do a management plan. I am your usual academic person and I have a training in neuropsychology. I am, however, an early adopter of open science, everything open, data, computation, publication. I also do some data science and neuroinformatics and advocate for good practices and good data stewardship. In my research, I deal with human brain imaging and clinical applications, which means I'm confronted with the general data protection regulation pretty much every day. The talk is pretty simple and split in three parts. First, I will address what is a data management plan and what you need to do, and then focus on when and how you should deal with GDPR. And finally, I will circle back to data management plan in the case you deal with what's called personal identifiable information. Let's look at the data management plan. Definition. If we just Google it, the first definition that comes up is something from the library in Stanford, and that sums up it pretty well. It deals with acquired data and with generated data, type of data that you will generate as you process them. And then you have to describe how you're going to manage these acquired and these generated data. You have to think about what type of analysis are you going to do, how you're going to store all of this data, how you're going to share some of this data, and how you're going to preserve this data. Now, interestingly, in that Google search, we can see at the bottom, I also have a question that comes up, which is why do you need a data management plan? And my answer is do not ask this question. Yes, it is required by funders, by your administration, but this is also an opportunity. An opportunity to request or ask enough computing power and space. If you plan in advance and you know you're going to have a lot of data, then you can ask for more power and space. Now, this is in general very good to improve your science, so it is worthwhile doing it. And it also makes science better itself by making your data fair. So what's the basic of your DMP? You need to describe what data will be collected, what type of analysis will be done, and what derived data will be generated. And this is in opposition, in a way, with what needs to be archived. You might collect some data, generate a huge amount of intermediate data for your analysis, but only want to archive summary statistics as a CSV, a couple of new images, or a mathematical model, and dump all your temporary data. Now, importantly, in those data that you want to archive, how will you document them? Which means you need to create metadata, which are data describing the data that you collected and generated. Now, the question that you must ask yourself is there a data curation standard? Maybe somebody out there already created things that can help you to create such metadata. Third, think about what will you share. And depending on what will you share, how are you going to achieve this? Do you have an infrastructure for this? And what type of license do you want to use? Finally, the question to ask is how will this data be preserved? If it's shared, it could be shared only for a few months, for a few years, for decades. This is the question of preservation. Will you use library storage? Do you use private, public repositories? Any information about the long-time preservation? Now, are your data going to be fair? A typical thing is to think that you must have your data open access to be fair. But findable and accessible simply means that it must be in an indexed repository. For instance, your university library or eBrains. Preferably, such repositories are searchable. Your data come with keywords and with metadata. Of course, if it's open access, it makes things easier, but access control is fine too. The question then is who will grant the access? Under which condition this access will be granted? Those are questions that you need to ask and answer in your DMP before actually trying to share some of the data. Now, fair means also interoperable and reusable. This comes with the fact that you need to use commonly used and open data format, and also use international standards and ontologies. And I pointed here at the top of the slide to some of the activities from INCF where there's a lot of standard and best practices that you can rely on. This is not trivial and is important because the file format, the structure, the organization, the naming, and the documentation, if you have any, might not be understandable by anybody else but yourself. Using standards allows the data to be reusable. I take here an example, which is the brain imaging data structure. As it says, a simple, intuitive way to organize and describe neuroimaging and behavioral data. All of this is done using consensus and ontologies which already exist. Every dataset, as a BEADS dataset, will come with a data descriptor, which describes the dataset, the authors, the founders, and possibly with a DOI, which allows to be citable. Here is, for instance, in neuroimaging for humans, MRI, PET imaging, we use standard format like NIFTY, FIF, EDF. Here is an example of an intracranial EEG in which we can see the institutional name and various information about the manufacturer, the number of channels, and so on. But this is not just for humans. This is for neuroimaging in general. So here is another example for microscopy, where the supported format would be, for instance, PNG, TIFF, or OMI. And then again, you have information about the manufacturer, the different information about the images. Every dataset will come also with information about the participants. And the participants don't have to be humans, as it is the case here. Finally, I will point to a few resources here, in particular the DMP Online. You may have other versions for your own country that might be available. And these basically are tools which allows you that you fill different information and generate a template DMP for you. And the OpenAIRE is also extremely useful website. And at the bottom, I point again to BEADS. Now, the second part of the talk focuses on GDPR. First, the question of when. When processing personal identifiable information, PII. These are data related to a person which leads to direct or indirect identification. For instance, using physical, physiological, genetic, mental, economic, cultural, or social data. Now, if your study is about animals, if you study from dead individuals, if you are using fully anonymous tissue data, all of this is out of scope, which means you don't have to worry about GDPR, which also means you have very little excuse not to share. Now, if you deal with data from living humans, but there is no associated metadata, for instance, no information about where they live, no health data associated to it, and there is no identifier, which means you only have a random ID and you can never go back to figure out who the data are from. Basically, it means the data are anonymous. If the data are anonymous, then you don't have to deal with GDPR. Anything else would be PII, including pseudonymized data, which is data which are going through a process of removing identifier, but they can remain PII. Now, prerequisite to share such type of data is to obtain consent. And I'm not talking about the consent of your study. I'm talking about consent to share. I here present the open brain consent, where you can go and check various information, and there is a specific place for GDPR, which is how to generate such consent, and also other information about data user agreement, about how to share, and so on. Now, these are prerequisites, which means that you need to consent for your study, which explains the study, and this is an ethic question. And now you have the consent to share, which has nothing to do with the ethic, which has to do with institution. GDPR follows principles of lawfulness, transparency, and fairness, which means you must not just the consent to share, but you also need to explain your participant how this will be shared, with whom, under which condition, and so on. Now let me quickly talk about usage. We often hear, yes, but with GDPR, this is very specific. If my study is about memory, then nothing else can be reused outside a study about memory. This is not the case. Yes, Recital 50 tells us that data can be reused if compatible with the initial consent and goal. But the Recital 33 also tells you that you do not need to be super specific when it comes to the goal of collecting the data when it's for research. Of course, private companies need to be very specific, but when it comes to research, we do not have to. For instance, you could say that you want to collect and share the data for biomedical research, and that is good enough. Now let me circle back to our data management plan in the case you have PII. Now let's look about the infrastructure requirements. To be fair, sharing PII requires consent to share, but also an infrastructure, which will allow the public data sharing, which means the metadata are findable, and you need access control to identify the users using legal agreement, such as a data user agreement and standard contractual clauses for non-EU users. Now, data management plan doesn't have to be fair. In many cases, you will not have the means to make PII easily findable because you don't have a platform for this. Using data publication and a dedicated repository, you may be able to do so. And I point here to some data which allowed us to share, for instance, clinical data on patients with brain tumors. Finally, you need to identify before your study if this is possible to do so. We need to check with your library and institution what is planned for you to comply with data sharing requirements. Right? This is their job to provide an infrastructure to support research and funders' requirements. This is not yours. Let me finish again by pointing to some resources, in particular the eBrain Service for Sensitive Data, or Health Data Cloud, which basically is a place where you can upload data, upload PII data and perform data analysis and share it with others. And also projects that I am working on, which is Neuroauthenticate, which maybe within a year or so, we hope will be a platform where you will be able to share PII, given that you have brain imaging data and that you already have consent, as explained earlier. Thank you.